So I wanted just to give you a kind of an overview of where we're going to be going here, because we talk about science, faith, and reason, and I talk about four fundamental features of the world. My background is such that I'm a synthesizer and I'm a generalist, and my scientific background is such that that teases out in such a way that I'm a philosopher of science. And so I like to put the components together in the microcosm and in the macrocosm, but also what I call the midicosm, or the biosphere. And so I seek to kind of put all those pieces together in a coherent way and tie the threads together. And I love the fact that there are four features of the universe and that there are evidences from science alone. So I'm not going to be using scripture or revelation, but I'm going to be claiming, though, that it has a bearing on the whole area of what implications it might have for what is called design, so that it's more than just a materialistic philosophy, but it could point beyond itself to something more robust. My argument is going to be that actually a top-down approach is always more rich, because the higher can account for the lower, but the lower can never account for the higher, as we'll be seeing. And I find that there are four fundamental sources of evidence that we can discover from science. And science, as we have now been exploring it, and has been expanding, especially in the last 60 years, vastly greater amounts of evidence for the implications for these matters in four areas. First of all, growing evidence for the universe's beginning, that it's not something that always existed as was previously thought, but rather something that actually had a beginning. Space, time, matter, and energy had an origination, a beginning. The second feature of the universe we'll be talking about is the very fine-tuning of the cosmos. And the more we discover about the universe, the more we discover it's finely tuned for life. And the features of fine-tuning are vast indeed. And when you go to Contact, if you recall the movie and the book that was based upon that, there were only a handful of considerations. It was called the Drake equation, and there were about 20 basic considerations for that. Now there are hundreds and hundreds of them, and they continue to grow. And with those growing parameters, the idea of a Goldilocks universe becomes so vast, so great, that now the only way to get out around that obvious implication is to postulate a multiverse, where there's an infinite number of verses to get around the idea that otherwise we won the cosmic lottery. And so we'll talk about that. And then the third feature of the universe is what's called biogenesis. Here we're talking not about evolution at all. We're simply talking about the origin of the first living cell, the first cell. So you can't really deal with evolution until you have life. You see, mutation and natural selection doesn't work until you actually have a living system. And there is no simple cell. There is no such thing as a simple cell, as we're going to be seeing. And so where did that first cell come from? And we discover the more we learn about the nature of the cell, the more exquisitely elegant and complex it really becomes. And then the fourth feature of the universe, of the cosmos, is our growing awareness and understanding of what is called information theory. Consider your DNA and the complex, information-rich biomacromolecules in your body, that each of your DNA molecules actually turns out that it has such a vast amount of information. It's the equivalent of several sets of what would be encyclopedias, vast specified information. Where does this come from? And so where does information come from? We'll be looking at all those components. And so I want to look at those four features of the world, and I'm going to begin with that first one about the idea of the evidence for the universe's beginning. But before I do that, worldviews and paradigms, that is to say, what is a person's worldview? And people often say that science and faith are inimical, but I'm going to be claiming that no one can live without some kind of fundamental presuppositions or principles that cannot in themselves be proven. So there's going to be a component of faith that's got to be involved. The typical objection is that science has nothing to do with faith. That science really, and this is most intriguing, only appeared once in human history. Empirically based science didn't appear all over the place. Oh yes, there was technology in China, in India, and other places. Surely there was technology, but not empirically based science. That appeared only in one place, and that's quite remarkable. So we had technology in China, as I mentioned. There was technology in Greece, tremendous effective technology. But what's intriguing here is there's no such thing as science as we know it until the period of the Renaissance in Christian Europe. And there's reasons, I claim, for that point. The claim is that the universe is rational and that the universe can be studied. And that is a basis, I'm going to be arguing, for why it became the best conditions for which and under which science could be formulated. You see, the Eastern philosophies of Hinduism and Buddhism effectively will claim that the universe is an illusion and that would have never originated science, because in such a mindset, science wouldn't be explored because the creation might have been worship, or it was an illusion. But instead, in this vision and the idea of the synthesis of the theistic understanding, it featured the idea of a logos. What is a logos? In the beginning was the word. You see, the mind and understanding and intelligence. And the idea of an ordering mind who ordered and organized all things together. So far from being incompatible, the fact is that science and faith then actually would work together, so that there's an ordering mind behind the cosmos. And if, secondly, we are crafted and created in the image of that ordering mind, then we would be able then to discern and understand and make sense out of that, because we would bear that image. We are rational beings. And so, indeed, the progenitors of science were, in fact, theists. They were not polytheists or materialists. It's very intriguing that Nicholas Copernicus, that Galileo, that William Harvey, that Blaise Pascal, the great mathematician, Isaac Newton, Joseph Priestley, Michael Faraday, Louis Pasteur, and Gregor Mendel, just to name a few. These were progenitors of science, and every one of them had a perspective that transcended a materialist view. All of them, in fact, embraced some kind of theistic, at least a deistic, but mostly a theistic mindset. They saw, effectively, in fact, that science was an act of worship. For them, theism was compatible with science, and that's significant. So both, the whole idea is that they embraced a worldview that was different, you see. So the concept here, it required a faith to understand it. And so instead, the idea of a skeptical mindset, which would claim that effectively that you have to have some kind of scientific method that is a scientific method plus naturalism. This was the thing that was imposed later on. Before, you had a scientific method that didn't impose a naturalistic philosophy. But science was redefined, especially in the 19th century, where there was a naturalistic mindset. But that's not what science actually turned out to have been. You see, it requires then this redefinition. They added naturalism as a philosophy that said that ultimate reality is nothing but matter and energy and time and space. There's nothing transcendent and spiritual at all. So, but that's what happened then. That was the method. But ultimate reality then, if that's all it is, would not really be compatible with this idea, because you see, if it's not that, then they're really saying, they're imposing a philosophy upon science which is not really correct. It's not ever what it was intended to be. Scientific method has never been that. The scientific method was always inference to the best explanation, always. The idea is go where the evidence leads. Instead of biasing and front-loading your idea, saying, well, if it looks like it's pointing to an intelligent designing agency, it can't be that. That would be to front-load the idea. It would be, in fact, to put in a bias from the get-go. That's a philosophical bias. That's not scientific. You go where the evidence is. I like to use the idea of a turtle on the top of a fence post. Okay, so have you ever seen a turtle on top of a post? I've actually seen this done. It's kind of an interesting idea. You don't have many options when you have a turtle on that. What are the possibilities? How did it get on the top of a post? It surely didn't crawl up there. So what are your possibilities? Maybe a tornado lifted it up and conveniently plopped it on there, you see? So one possibility is it just happened to crawl up. It's not where I'd put my money. The second is that a tornado conveniently plopped it there. What's the third possibility? Somebody, prankster, put it on there, and that's where I'd put my money, you see. But if you were to say, no, it couldn't have been some intelligent agency that put it there, you see what you're doing? You're eliminating the possibilities from the get-go, and you're not going where the evidence properly leads. And that's what I'm suggesting here. Go where the evidence takes you. In fact, scientific knowledge is not the only kind of knowledge. This is a sort of scientism that often has prevailed, where the idea of it's not scientific, it can't be true. And in fact, Carl Sagan is known as saying that the cosmos is all that ever was or is or ever will be. Is that a scientific statement? Is it? In fact, that's not a scientific statement. That's a philosophical statement, and very bad philosophy at that, you see. You can't, so you really have to realize that there are multiple kinds of knowledge, and science is only one. We have to be modest in our claims. Science is not the only approach to knowledge. There are other forms of knowledge. For example, historical knowledge has its own avenue of inquiry, its own rules of evidence. There's also personal knowledge. Michael Polanyi talked about the tacit dimension, personal knowledge. And that is an entirely different form of knowledge. There's also moral knowledge, you see. You're not going to get that in a scientific experiment. And then there's also philosophical knowledge. There's also going to be aesthetic knowledge, the knowledge of a thing that's beautiful. What makes a thing aesthetically wonderful and beautiful? Then there's also religious knowledge. So I'm suggesting that all of these require its own what's called epistemology, which means the way of knowing. And not one of them is exhaustive, and we need to then see that each of them contributes to a larger whole, because we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and we can see that we don't want to let one rule the whole and eliminate the others, you see. That would be an imperialistic notion. So don't let the idea that if it's not scientific, as they get to define it, say that it can't be true. That it would not be right. Design theory is the idea that some have claimed that the quest for design will kill science, and I'm saying that's not true. Even Thomas Nagel, who's an atheist, who made this statement, and I admire him for his openness and his consistency in his logic. He said it can potentially be scientific to argue that the data of DNA and life points to an intelligent designer, even if science cannot tell you the identity of the designer or what is going on in the designer's mind. And I think that's a very remarkable statement for him to make. He doesn't go with that, but he says it's not impossible for that to be the case. You can't eliminate that scientifically. And so there are a number of design theorists, and there's a whole spectrum of design theorists. It's a big tent. And it goes really, even from those who embrace atheism, there are some who are atheists who still embrace some kind of design agency. They just don't claim that they can know what it is. It's interesting. Deistic, theistic, even down to six-day creationism. There's a big tent. What's fascinating about that is that they all are involved in some kind of design agency. Albert Einstein was the God of Spinoza. It was a kind of a super intellect, and so was Antony Flew, more of a deistic, not a theistic view. But at 82, he concluded, this man was fascinating. He was the Richard Dawkins of his era in the 60s and 70s. Fascinating writer. And I'm amazed when he discovered the nature of the cell and the fact that the DNA turned out to be so elegant and so information rich. When he discovered that, I admire the fact that he said my books were wrong. Now, that's not many men who at 82 will say my books were wrong. Usually you have a vested interest. And so he changed his view and became a deist. I don't know at the end if he went the next step and concluded that it's more than just deism, that there's a personal agency. But at any rate, I'm impressed. But the fact is, here on the entire spectrum, the thing they share in common is designing agency. So here we're focusing not on the how, but the who. You see the concept there? And that's the commonality that we're looking at here. And so when we're looking at this idea then, we're looking at then a range of views that in my view is remarkable. So in looking at this then, there are others though who hear about this and in response to the growing evidence for this, react with scorn and abusiveness, really. You call that science, you call that intelligence, and they compare this to phrenology, you see, or some kind of magic. And so it's just guilt by association or name-calling, which last time I checked aren't good forms of arguments, you see, and that's really what it comes down. My view is, let's look at the evidence instead of calling us each other's names and so forth. Look at the evidence, go where the evidence leads instead of you calling, oh, you're one of those fighting fundamentalists, or you're one of those nutcases, or whatever. So I've noticed, though, that people are not thinking as clearly as they used to do, and consequently, I find that they're not able to actually engage in critical reasoning as well as they did in the past. That is to say, let the evidence speak for itself. Let us reason together instead of using just a name. Oh, you're one of those, you see, or you're saying, or just name calling. You're ad hominem. Those are not arguments. But people actually amaze me because they suppose they are. They're not. So you go and look at the evidence itself. In fact, science itself already does distinguish design from accident. This is not unscientific to do that. You see, there are methods in which we can do that because this is common. It's found, for example, in insurance claim investigation, isn't it? So we consider, was that thing arson or was it an accident? You see, we have to discern. And there are methods by which we can determine that. Cryptology is necessary. Was it an accident? Or artificial intelligence, or archaeology. And so does that object actually, was that an actual object that was created? Was that an axe head? Or does it just look like that? So you have to be able to determine. So whether it was a real thing or not. Or SETI, what does that mean? The search for extraterrestrial intelligence. They're looking for signals that are evidences of design. Usually, it's sequences of prime numbers, you see, and they haven't been able to find it. But the point is, they're looking for design evidence. Also, random number generation. So there are methods by which we already know about the difference between. So we're claiming that design is not creationism in disguise, but rather it's examining the evidence and going where it leads us. So it's not a matter of he's one of those creationists or fundamentalists. In fact, fundamentalism seems to be the new F word in our culture. But at any rate, design theory predictions, in fact, are intriguing because there are scientific predictions that we can make when we embrace the concept of design theory that can be helpful in research. For example, and I made this presentation a number of years ago, and these have been borne out. When we look at DNA, only 2% of the DNA in your body is actually related to the genetic dynamic of forming proteins. The rest of it has been called junk DNA. And it was based on the arrogant assumption that because we didn't know what it does, it must be leftover junk. That has been dispelled because much of that has now been shown not to be the case. And furthermore, deeper complexity, information, elegance of the universe is going to be this trend, not less. That has also been borne out. And indeed, the momentum of evidence has gone in this direction. Every year, we see growing, not diminishing, complexity, elegance, and information on the microcosm, on the midicosm, on the macrocosm. No matter what you study, it becomes much more elegant, much more amazing, much more astonishing than you could have ever imagined before. And so it will continue, I think, to go in that direction. So we now are going to go to the first of the features that we were talking about, evidence for the universe's beginning. And there's an if proposition that I use, and it's this: if anything now exists, something must be eternal, or something not eternal must have emerged from nothing. So that's the if proposition. If anything now exists, something must be eternal, or something not eternal must have emerged from nothing. And that's going to lead to 4 possibilities then. So the four possibilities are: the universe is an illusion. That says nothing exists. So in that case, if anything now exists, well, in this case, nothing exists. You get the idea? So that's one possibility around it. Oh, well, that's the solution then. Nothing exists. But the problem with nothing exists, though, is that it's really a rather difficult problem to have, because if the universe is an illusion, it's a rather consistent one, isn't it? You discover that it's ruthlessly consistent. No one can live consistently with that illusion. It lacks rational coherence and livability. It's like saying, I can't speak a word in English. Well, you just did, you see. Even the person who believes that the universe is an illusion looks both ways before crossing the street. You live better than that philosophy. And so the concept here is it defeats itself. It's not livable, and it doesn't make any sense. The second possibility, well, what if the universe is eternal? And that was the popular scientific view. It was the steady state theory. And most astronomers really wanted that to be the case, because then you didn't have to worry about any kind of creation event. That was the popular press. And indeed, this was the idea in which matter and energy always existed, and the majority view among astronomers in the early part of the 20th century, astronomer Fred Hoyle once postulated that the universe was emerged from nothing, and the universe was created by an eternal being. Those are the 4 possibilities. So the universe is an illusion then. So as I said before, we can't really live with that. It's not a consistent philosophy. The universe is eternal. The steady state theory was the claim that matter and energy have always existed. And Fred Hoyle then postulated this idea that it was constantly being created at the fringe. Because you see, the first law of thermodynamics says that the total amount of matter and energy is always the same. Well, what happens then, some kind of continuous creation, because the amount of useful energy was diminishing. And so he was actually saying that the universe was expanding in a universal format. So he was saying that there had to be some form of continuous influx of new energy so the universe would not wear out. Otherwise, the universe would have worn out by now. But they were really faith propositions without any evidence. And so ultimately then, what actually defeated that was the universe being eternal, the Big Bang theory, and matter and energy had a starting point. And this concept here was something that was demonstrated by these scientists at Bell Labs. Robert Wilson and Arno Penzias accidentally discovered a cosmic background radiation that was uniform, and it gave scientific evidence for an actual beginning of the cosmos. And then the Cosmic Background Explorer COBE satellite was launched. And more recent WMAP satellites gave us additional details. And it's very strange because the apparent evidence, and this is a subject to debate but the current theory is that 73% of the cosmos, according to these speculative theories now, based upon these, is that 73% of the universe consists of something we don't even know what it is. So because we call it dark energy as if we knew what that meant. And then another 23% consists of dark matter, as if we knew what that meant, which means that only 4% is ordinary matter. That's a very curious consequence, if you can imagine. And so, as Alice in Wonderland said, the universe gets curiouser and curiouser. And when we see, and then it gets even more interesting because the universe will continue to expand. But now we see that the greater the distance, the greater the expansion rate. And so the further it goes out, the greater the rate. So what's causing that to occur? So this is why they are now postulating this form of dark energy that's to account for it. So the universe is very curious indeed. And where did all of this come from? Where does this matter and energy? So the universe is really consistent with the idea of some kind of a beginning event, which is what you would predict by reading Genesis 1. There's also the second law of thermodynamics, which is another argument, which is the law that relates to increasing what's called entropy. The idea here is that things left to themselves tend to move toward chaos and disorder. Here's the Department of Entropy. It's a total chaos. And this is evident on many levels. Notice that your car isn't going to develop a new and better fuel injection system if you leave it sitting in the garage. And you notice your desk or anything left to itself is going to run down. It's not going to get better. Everything, even in relationships, requires an infusion of intentional energy to keep things going. Otherwise, everything seems to erode and fall apart. And the idea is this: the total amount of matter and energy is constant. That's the first law. But the amount of useful energy diminishes. So while the total amount of energy is the same, this curve shows that the amount of useful energy diminishes as time goes on in a closed system. So if you plotted this graph then, it diminishes in an exponential decay curve. And time zero is increasing entropy and disorder as time goes by. So if you go further into the future, it would look like the universe is going to then experience a heat death. There would be eventually not enough sustainable energy to keep even any living system alive. It's like if you go backwards, though, it would go back to a point where the universe was perfectly wound up. You can't have more useful energy than there's total energy. So at one point then, it would point back to a point where the entire amount of energy in the universe was perfectly usable. That's a significant idea. It would suggest then a special event in which there was a singularity, some kind of an event in which that occurred. And so it seems to point then to something radical that we can now explore and see that in both directions then it seems to point to some kind of an evidence, the second law, to an ordering event at the beginning, and it suggests something that the universe by itself could not sustain itself in the end. But yet we're still here, so it's not infinitely old. So the idea of the universe had a beginning is this concept then of the second law of thermodynamics. And so this is a very significant concept indeed, because it has radical implications for our thinking and for our way of understanding in the cosmos itself. So this is to me a very important concept for us to really tease out and process together and to understand what does all this mean in terms of how we are going to understand this world, this universe, this grasp about what that would look like? How do we understand the world? And we, again, as I said before, look at this deep and strange world. And to be honest with you, I'm confident that new things will be discovered we don't even know about. So you have to be very careful before you embrace this cosmology of our present time. Hold it with a loose grip, because you're pretty sure new things are going to be popping up that we don't even know about. And that's an important thought as well. So going back then to our initial thoughts about the four possibilities that we had here then. So then we're saying that it's not an illusion, it's not eternal, it didn't emerge from nothing. Then the only other option we have is some necessary being, some origin, that matter and energy and space and time had a beginning. And it makes me think of the beginning of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so the idea of an ordering mind as the agency behind this. So that would be a necessary being, not something contingent. If you follow science, go where the evidence takes you. So I'm suggesting here, by the way, science, the interesting thing about science is the best science is not necessarily that it's a majority view. In fact, very often, the idea of a science by consensus is often not the case. But many times it was people who would go outside the normal paradigms who would actually then see and raise questions and ask a new question. So consider, for example, the paradigm shift with Copernicus, and when you had the Ptolemaic idea, where you had the geocentric solar system. So here you had the Earth as the center of our solar system, and that was held by Ptolemy, and that was for many centuries, since the first century. And so the basic default was that it must be that the Earth is the center, that the sun goes around the Earth, the planets go around the Earth. And so for Copernicus to propose that instead it's a heliocentric rather than a geocentric was a very radical thing. Now, others had anticipated this as well, but the significant thing is that he published this posthumously, knowing that there would be some real problems. But his idea would be that if you instead said that the sun is at the center, it accounted far more accurately for what we really observe, including the retrograde movements of Saturn and Jupiter relative to, because it seems to go backwards, which is exactly what you would expect. They had to come up with all these extra theories to account for that, and it was getting more and more clumsy, you see. So he is a much more elegant way of seeing it. And as soon as you see it, yes, it makes sense. But there was a pushback because the majority view was opposed to that. So science by consensus, but the majority view is often wrong. You see, the history of science is a path that's been strewn with discarded theories. There was the primary view was that there was this idea of an ether that carried everything. And that was not disproven until the Michelson-Morley experiment, and I think it was 1901. So that was a majority view. And spontaneous generation of life was a majority view. So we have to be very careful. Science by consensus is often wrong. So science is truth. You know this. Truth isn't determined by a majority view. So we recognize that often it's an outlier, like Pasteur and others, like Mendel, who will say, let's look at it from another point of view. But there's going to be a pushback because people have a commitment to a particular orientation. So in my view, let's just hold back. Let's consider this, but let's consider that. You see, so when we're considering this whole notion then of doing a rational assessment of ideas, what you're dealing with then is an assessment of two sides of an argument. I find that people are much less capable of hearing two sides of an argument today. It's either one or the other. And I think it's very wise for us to at least hear credence or listen to this side, but let's hear another side of the argument, you see, because that's what's called rhetoric. And rhetoric is gone in our time. But you need to learn from those sides. So I'm suggesting then that when you go where the evidence leads, whether it's a majority view or not, that's a wisdom to hear. So instead of just refuting the other, saying, but that's not what we are all saying. Instead of guilt by association and again, name calling, look at the hard evidence is what I'm saying. And that's where we go. And I think that's often outliers who are the ones who get these insights, because you get so much in the guild that you then are so committed to that, you're afraid to even consider another point of view, another perspective. So what I'm trying to encourage people to do is hear both sides of an issue and weigh the evidence and then consider it. And I think we do well to consider that. That's like Mars Hill and Paul's assessment there of consider, and he looked at their philosophers and teased that out and trying to find common ground and also being winsome and compelling. So going back then, a deist holds that the universe was begun, that there was some kind of a God that started it all, but that he's not involved in the world. He's not active in the world, you see. It's like a clockwork. He started the world, and he hasn't been seen since. He got it started. It's a clockwork universe, you see. And so his action in the world is that of a distant being. So he got it started, but you haven't seen him since. So they would then say miracles are incompatible with that. Whereas a theist, yes, but a theist embraces something where God is active in the world and does, in fact, involve himself in space-time history. And so that would be the next step. Because you see, it's not just a matter of him making the world, but also entering into the world and being a part of it. And that's where miracles would come in. And they're not against the idea of rules of science, but they are local modifications of those rules, exceptions that he makes. But the exceptions prove the rule. So the resurrection of Christ would be the example of a special revelation of God in space-time history. And we'll be talking about that. So, in fact, Paul's argument, again, is that it's not just that he made it all and never came back, but that's his resurrection was a decisive encounter in space-time history with the one who made all things. So theism is more robust. It means that the one who made all things is also the one who knows you and loves you. Now, the interesting thing in the scriptures is that it tells us, I'm just out of time, Romans 1 tells us that you can know about his eternal power and divine nature being understood through what has been made. But what you could not know from just general revelation, though you could know about the exquisite mind of the maker, you could never guess that the one who made the galaxies is also the one who came to this world to die for you. The one who loves you, the one who made all things is also the lover of your soul. That you could never get. You could never get the idea that he's the sacred romancer who woos you and pursues you. That you'd never get from the general revelation. That requires a special revelation. So that's another step beyond that. But this brings us up to that point where it opens us up to the possibility of the one then who can take us to the next step of knowing him. So it's not just knowing about him, it's knowing him. And so in our next time together then, we're going to be exploring then this idea of the other methods in which we can actually consider. The next one we're going to look at is going to be the evidence for the fine-tuning of the cosmos. And that'll be a lot of fun to do. We're going to be exploring all kinds of levels about just the right galaxy or the right solar system or the right star, the right moon, the right kind of planet. Everything has to be just Goldilocks. Everything's got to be perfect in ways you could hardly even imagine. The right physics, everything, the right expansion rate. And so we'll be exploring that in our next time together. And the implications of that are quite profound as well. Let me close with a prayer. Lord, we thank you, the one